So if you're watching this, I do want to thank you. This is part 2 of Thieves in the Church. Now, I have 42 years of experience, 5 full-time pastorates, 3 interim pastorates, and 1 supply pastorate. Now, as far as I know, there was only 1 case of actual theft or fraud or embezzlement. I'm trying to use all 3 terms here. In other words, overall, from my life, the churches I served were churches of honesty and integrity. Now, I'm not sure that that's going to continue, and here's why. And this is my prediction, okay? I'm not a prophet. I don't claim that I have all the answers and I'm always correct. But my prediction is that there's going to be much more fraud, embezzlement, and theft. Why? Because these independent churches are rising up everywhere. And they're just founded by individuals who have a vision and want to do things. In addition to that, a lot of the mega churches are now under like a mega corporation that they fund establishing a church somewhere, like Walmart would establish construction of a Walmart store in a certain area. So these new churches, whether they're part of a mega church system or just little independent churches rising up with no connection to any denomination, are very subject to the possibility of theft, fraud, and embezzlement. Why? Because oftentimes they're very pastor-centered. Now, I do have an example of that when I served a church in a city, and the church building had been built from the late 1800s into the early part of 1900, was very old and outdated. The members were dying off, so the population that I was serving were primarily older members in an older building. A young family came and joined us, and they stayed with us for about two or 3 years, and then a fancy new church near their home was built, and the parking lot was full every Sunday with cars. They had programs for all ages. They had rock bands instead of church hymns, and we lost them. But before they left, I wanted to have what I called an exit interview with them, and they agreed. And I said, is there anything at all that's kind of maybe doubtful in your mind about this move to another church? Anything at all that's a little bit questionable about this new situation? And the wife, who by the way was mother of 2 teens who were benefiting by all these teen programs, said yes, there is. And that is that the youth had worked diligently for a period of a couple years with fundraisers, car washes, and all that thing to build a separate building that was their own. And she told me that the pastor of the church was told by the Lord that money that was raised by the youth for a youth building was to go to a missionary. So the pastor of the church went to the bank and depleted the funds. Now, of course, that is good thinking, like maybe I shouldn't go to a church like that. And I would say that the type of churches I've served, and for my 42 years, it could have never occurred, because my name was never on any bank account of any church that I served. for any reason. My name was never on any checkbook, and so forth. So due to the rise of these mega churches and these independent little churches, I think theft will increase, fraud will increase, embezzlement will increase. And remember, we're approaching the end of the end times. And the Bible tells us, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the coming of the Son of Man. So in other words, evil will grow worse. And part of the evil will be this theft of the offerings that God's people bring to be used for the furthering of the kingdom of God. So do I know of any other situations? Yes, I know of, but they're not part of my personal ministry and life. I attended training to be an interim pastor, and at that conference there was a pastor who was going to go into a church that the former church treasurer had embezzled $60,000. Was well known. All the members knew. No charges were filed because the man had been a treasurer for 30 years, and he was well respected, well liked, and also the wife was well liked and well respected, and folks felt sorry for their situation with the medical expenses. So here was a pastor going into a church where it was well known that about $60,000 was embezzled. No charges were filed, which means that there's no hope of recovering anything. But that was their choice. Now again, if charges are not filed, it's completely in the hands of the church. So I know that one existed, but it wasn't part of my personal life. When I was in seminary, my preaching professor told us of his first assignment as a young man. He went to a church. His first assignment was, as a pastor preacher, to go to a church where the pastor had stolen a large sum of money and ran off with the church secretary, who was not his wife. I went to another pastorate, and as soon as I moved in there, I was informed about the church that was about 5 miles away had just gone through an embezzlement. Large sums of money were embezzled by the treasurer. In this case, charges were filed, and I believe the treasurer was serving some time for this crime that was committed against the church. Now, if you're not familiar with the term AME, it stands for African Methodist Episcopal, and the African Methodist Episcopal Church has recently gone through a major scandal of the retirement fund for their pastors, missing about $100 million. Now, I was privileged to get to know some good folks at the AME church that was about 2 blocks away from the church where I was serving, and I got to know the pastor quite well, and the pastor told me all about this, and I was shocked, horrified. So just because the money is in the hands of the church and was given by godly people doesn't mean that people are not going to be tempted to try to steal it. Now, these are my definitions. They're nothing legal. It's just my simple way of trying to understand. Theft is done by hands. Fraud is done by mouth. It's a deception. Embezzlement is done by the eyes. In other words, you rearrange the statistics and do something in such a way that people won't notice it. Now, this was not a church, but in one of the churches I served, one of the key individuals in our church ran a small factory, employing maybe about 30 or 40 people. And he told me of a situation where the treasurer or the financial individual watching over everything, each pay period would write one additional check to herself. Just one. And over the years it added up to a pretty large sum of money. But it was a form of embezzlement, a form of trickery for the eyes. And the check wasn't necessarily even in front of everybody in terms of looking at it. In other words, they might not have recorded it. And so you would see checks out of sequence each pay period with one missing. Now that was a factory, it wasn't the church. But it's just an example of how embezzlement is like for the eyes, to fool your eyes. Fraud is people fooling you by their mouth, by what they say. And fraud is something like where people will say, we want to build a new superstructure church building. And if you give us $10,000 today, tomorrow, after 10 years, we'll give you $15,000 back. In other words, they create stock and they give them some kind of a phony certificate. And it's fraud. And there's been a lot of that in the mega churches. Okay, so what can a church do? Maybe you're in a church and you might be saying, well, hey, what can we do? Well, one of the best systems that I served under, and I've only saw it once in one church that I served in, was that all checks were signed by two individuals, a treasurer and an assistant treasurer. In other words, the check itself would never be valid unless both signatures were on it. And I know it's a little extra work, but it's a really good system because at least there's one individual watching another individual. It's sort of a one-on-one. And then that individual can keep an eye on. Now, because of convenience, many churches don't do this. But it's a really great idea because it cuts down the possibility of temptation. Remember, it's about temptation. Full and complete reports of all funds and the flow of all finances given each month to all members. No hidden funds. In other words, not an incomplete report. A comprehensive report for everyone at least once a month. Not some little reduced thing that people can only see the money that comes in, the money that goes out each week or each month. I'm talking about a full report of all the funds, so there's nothing in hiding. Now, every church each year should have audit, and I would say it needs to be done by outside sources, professionally. This is a good thing for treasurers because it can give a treasurer a lot of comfort to know that they're being watched and everybody knows they're being watched. Now the audit can occur from within. Now I was in one church where they had 3 people every year who worked in the area of finances in their employment get the books of the church and sit down as a group and spend the entire evening together and look at everything. In other words, the audit came from within, from their own auditors. In fact, they were elected in the meeting of the congregation. That's valid and that's good because at least somebody's looking at the books once a year, at least somebody. The best one is to do it outside of the church, and that would be an expense, and many churches don't want to spend the money. But it's well worth the money to spend to have everything on the level for everybody. they could just put it in the budget every year, that there's going to be an audit. It's going to come from the outside. It's going to come from an auditing firm. And I guess there are two types of audits. By the way, this is not my field, so I'm not using terms that are correct. I'm a pastor preacher, but I think I'm just going to call it like the short audit and then the lengthy audit. Now that may not be correct, but the idea is auditing needs to be done in every church, no matter how small or how large. Every church, no exceptions. Now, in my years of ministry, the only church that was ever faithful to this was the ones who did the audit within. Almost all the other churches never did an audit at all. Zero. Now that's kind of a poor thing for God's people, because theft could be occurring. Embezzlement could be occurring. Now remember this, everyone thinks that everything is safe because the church is a trusting environment. And indeed, I testify for 42 years. Almost every situation seemed to be okay. However, what people fail to realize is the great power of temptation. And what the Holy Scriptures say about the love of money is the root of all evil. So in other words, when large sums of money are floating around, it is possible for people to get tempted. Now, oftentimes, large sums of money can come in to a church, and when they do, oftentimes leaders like to just sort of get hold of them and sort of push them aside and not really say a whole lot about them. So I was in a situation where almost $250,000 came into this church, and it almost sort of disappeared without any discussion or making anyone aware of it. Now, it was not stolen. There was no theft, but it went right to investments in stock funds. And that's a whole big issue. Should churches even be involved in investing money in stock funds? Now, you understand the definition of a church is a nonprofit organization. The minute you start using money to make money, that's called profit. So almost all churches are involved in some way in, quote, investments. I'm just calling it into question only because it just doesn't seem right to take in God's offerings and then say, oh, isn't this wonderful? We can go buy some more shares in a stock fund or a bond fund. Now, it's happened in almost all the churches that I've served in. In the first church I served in, it was CD, certificates of deposit. But in all the other churches I've served in, there was some involvement somewhere with stock funds and bond funds. I call it into question. So please, do not pass condemnation on me. This is 42 years, and my conclusion is I think that churches should not be investing in stock funds and bond funds, because those offerings were given to be used for the glory of God and the furthering of the kingdom of God. So once again, a full and complete report needs to go to everyone. No secrets, full disclosure, no secret investing in stock funds and bond funds. It's a very common thing, by the way. Very common. And then once it starts, it becomes a mania. I think I may have told you in the last video, in the one church I served in, They took every single gift of like estate gifts that they had and translated them into high-risk stock fund. And that financial basis of the church was cut in half in 2008 when the stock market fell. And I said in that other video, I'd have liked to have gone to the cemetery and resurrected from the dead all the families that gave that money and let them come to a board meeting with their grave clothes on and talk to the people about what they did with the money they thought they were given to further the gospel. Instead, it went into stock funds to play the stock market.